I totally forgot to put the other thumbnail up, so now you're just gonna get this awkward picture of myself looking like this. Because I tend to use just the, anime thumb, or not the anime, but the me and the anime bar thumbnail for these streams, but okay, I got that. Just gonna post some stuff up here. Okay, start with a nice sip here first. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Samuel, and today we are completing the, I guess I would say, the first half, if you will, of the Book of Samuel, because technically, as I've said multiple times, the Book of Samuel is divided into two books, but really you should treat them as if it's one book, because it really is one book, more than it is two separate books, right? But of course, I'm pretty sure, of course, this is just most Bible scholars thinking, and I'm no exception to the rule, that most people think that, like, the earlier, the post-exilic Jews, when they were, compiling what would be the Old Testament, felt like there was a need for that break in between First and Second Samuel because of a major shift in not so much the theme, but the way the theme is played out, right? So, if the major theme of the Book of Samuel is the idea, the revelation to the prophet Samuel, that only God can be king, the book being divided two parts would be, the two different kings kind of proving that point, right? And so, First Samuel has Saul mostly as the king of it. Of course, like, there's like 8, 9 chapters of the Book of Samuel where Saul isn't king, but you get, that's besides the point. Because of course, before there even is a king, that's where Samuel receives the revelation, right? And so as we end First Samuel, the like Saul as king will come to an end. That's kind of like, spoiler, quote unquote, of what's going to happen. That basically it's going to be the end of Saul's reign as king, And then of course Second Samuel picks it, goes a different direction, right? That there'll be a new king, right? And that would be David, naturally, as David is supposedly anointed to be king, but he's not king yet. And then Second Samuel, we'll get to that. So that's kind of, but even with when David becomes king, the central theme of, well, only God can be king will be played out. But how it plays out, well, you'll see that as we go through it. But as we read through the end of First Samuel, we'll see the end of Saul's time as king. I'm just gonna do a quick setting check, because you may have noticed that I've improved the video quality, because me and my stupidness, my stupidity, never actually brought up my bitrate, despite having like better internet. But of course, like, even the internet I have now, as decent as it is, still isn't quite powerful to do like like the 1080 or anything like that, and I need a better webcam for that anyway. But before I was always running on like 5K bits for my output, which is not actually that much apparently. That no one told me that. So, and when I'm doing these reading streams, that doesn't matter that much. But it's when I do my game streams that like the higher bitrate actually does make a huge difference, right? But anyway, that's just a side note. So today we're gonna dive into just reading the last part of First Samuel. So we have a very clear, where we're going to end today. We're just gonna read the last 4 chapters of First Samuel, and then it'll be the end of the stream. And of course, next week, I'm pretty sure next week, depending on like certain scheduling things, next week I'll start Second Samuel. So I will be using the New International Version, or NIV. So you can whip up, Bible on your desktop or whatever, or use the Bible app on your phone. I mean, it's free, so there's no reason not to, and I encourage you guys to follow along as I read. And I will just start us off with a quick word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read the end of 1 Samuel, you would show us more of who you are and how we should relate to you, and how we should be mindful of the reality of only you can be king, and that only you should be the attention of our worship and our devotion. I just pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so let me just flip to the right page, because I don't have it flipped here. I have my notes here, but here it's like I'm not on the right page. 1 Samuel, and we're starting chapter 28. Now, before I actually start reading chapter 28, I'm just going to kind of give a quick recap of chapter 27, because I did speed through that last week, because 27 was actually really short. So basically, what happened was David had conceded that, like, okay, he's already spared Saul twice, right? But David kind of, he's not an idiot. So he figures out that, like, okay, like, it's only a matter of time before, like, Saul actually catches me. So I gotta get out of, like, Judea. I gotta get the hell out of here, right? And so David decides to move into the place that no one would think to look for him, right? And so he lives in Gath. Now, Gath is basically a southern part near the coast of the land of Israel. Well, it's now Israel. It's the easiest modern parallel would be like basically Gaza, a little bit south of Gaza, right? Because Gaza is like more of like, well, I mean, it's still southwest of Israel and is on the coast there. So that area, right? It's like Gaza and a little bit more south as we like entered like Jordan, right? And so David retreats there. And during that time, the Philistines had kind of made a major foothold there, right? So the Philistines are living there, which is funny because of course David is like the enemy of the Philistines, right? Like David's been killing Philistines left and right for years, and now David is hiding among them because of course David is afraid of Saul. And something I didn't actually make point this out last week, but I might as well kind of point it out now, which is actually I think it's kind of funny, where somehow for some strange reason David feels more safe hanging around people that like an entire people that have every right to hate him and want to kill the guy because he's been slaughtering them by the thousands. You know, he feels safer hanging around with them than he does with Saul, right? But of course, there's an interesting dynamic of which to think why David would think that it's safer to hang around with the Philistines than it is to hang out with Saul, right? Or like to be in Judea where Saul is still chasing him around. Because of course, part of it is also David's respect for Saul. That would be his weakness, right? Because think of it this way, right? If David is, you know, as he's living among the Philistines, and if the Philistines decide to attack him, then David will be like, yeah, you know, bring it on, right? I'll kill every last one of you, right? And David would just be like, bring it on, and he'd kill them. But if Saul were to, you know, if Saul were to actually get the jump on him, I think, and you know, based on reading chapters 24 and 26, David would actually just like not really let Saul, you know, he would actually almost let Saul kill him because he would refuse, David would refuse to retaliate against Saul. Like he would refuse, right? And we've seen several cases, not just in chapter 26 and 24, where David spares Saul and the whole rhetoric of like David refuses to touch the Lord's anointed. He refuses. But there were times where, like, you know, I think it was a chapter like 18 or something. I have to look back on it. And I did mention it in like those when I read those chapters that like there was that one scene where David's like playing his lyre and then throws his spear and the Bible says that Saul threw it twice at David. Which is hilarious because the idea that's there that the Bible writer was implying was that not only did, you know, Saul throw the spear at David, David actually stuck around long enough for Saul to pick up the spear and take a second shot at him, right? And so, you know, David would just he refuses to fight Saul. And that would eventually be his downfall. And David kind of realizes this, that like, okay, if I don't fight Saul, he will kill me. But at the same time, David refuses to fight Saul. He refuses, right? And so I think that's probably the logic David has of why he would, you know, hang around with the Philistines and maybe even think he's safer among them, right? Because if the Philistines were to fight him, he would just kill them with reckless abandon, right? He would just, he wouldn't care, right? It would just be another target to him, right? And so that's, it's kind of funny that that happens and the Bible puts it that way, that, right? That, you know, David feels safer with the Philistines than he does in his home, right? In his homeland. So David is living with the Philistines in Gath, and he gains favor from one of the young princes, right? Because obviously, how it would work was there's different tribes, if you will, similar like you know a Philistine equivalent of like the tribes of Israel kind of thing, right? So there's obviously like different groups within the Philistines, and one of the princes, you know, David becomes good friends with him. They're like drinking buddies, basically, right? And then David gains favor, and you know, the guy really likes him and makes him like his bodyguard, basically, which is you know really strange, right? And of course, there's this motif in the Bible that you know God's people, even among their enemies, they can gain favor and become you know well liked, even by their enemies. And they can go up pretty quickly in like position, right? And so you know we read this with like Joseph, right? You know he goes from like a slave in Egypt to basically second in command next to Pharaoh, right? And so there are other cases like this, right? And then of course a lot of people would recall Daniel, right? Daniel ends up being like the equivalent of like um, I'm trying to think of like what's the American equivalent, but like in Canada it would be like the cabinet, basically like the Senate, right? So Daniel becomes like a member of the Senate um, in Babylon, right? So these kind of interesting moments where like the Israelites, even though they're among people that would be viewed as their enemies, they climb up pretty quickly in position and power. And David is no exception, right? David, he gets a lot of position and power. So he goes from basically like, he would be what where he would normally be like a wanted man, and nobody would want David around because he's the arch enemy of the Philistines. And here, he's already gained this kind of political power among them, and he's the bodyguard of like one of the princes, right? And so now time has passed as we go to chapter 28. Time has passed, and David's been living with the Philistines for a while, about just over a year. The Bible says like a year and several months, so just over a year, right? And of course, you know, Dave's an interesting character, right? Because he's also kind of praised here for basically being like a saboteur, because he sabotages the Philistines while he climbs up in like rank, right? So he's like the bodyguard of a prince, but he's also like raiding Philistine villages, right? Like, uh, that normally that'd be a really bad thing, right? You wouldn't want your bodyguard to be a guy who's killing your own people, but here David is, bodyguard to a Philistine prince while he's killing Philistines, right? And so that's where David is now. And then of course, like Saul's been running around Israel and he's gone mad and whatever, right? And so that is kind of what happens in chapter 27 in a nutshell. And so now we move to chapter 28 after this like year and several months have passed. Chapter 28. Now in those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." And David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." And Achish replied, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Now Saul was, sorry, verse 3. Now Samuel was dead, not Saul. Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Now Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. Now the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set camp. I'm just gonna move my microphone. And set camp. Where did he go? At Gilboa. So Saul had set up camp at Gilboa. Verse 5. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid, and terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him, but by dreams or did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. So basically, God was not speaking to Saul. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a necromancer, so I may go and inquire of her." There is, oh sorry, I didn't do Saul's voice. "Find me a woman who is a necromancer, so I may go and inquire of her." "There is one in Endor," they said. So Saul disguised himself and putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. So why have you set up a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up the prophet Samuel," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul." And the king said, "Do not be afraid. Now tell me what you see." The woman said, I see a ghostly figure coming out of the earth." "And what does he look like?" Saul asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. And then Samuel said to Saul, oh wow, it's been a while since Samuel's ever said anything. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you troubled me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called upon you to tell me what to do." And Samuel said, Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and has given it to your neighbor, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Immediately, Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and all that night. When the woman came to Saul and saw how he was greatly shooken, she said, "Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night, they got up, and they left. So chapter 28 is a very strange chapter. That's the best way of wording it. It's a very strange chapter. And yeah, a lot of Bible scholars really don't know what to do with chapter 28 at times, right? So I'll kind of explain what's going on here. So, okay, we just skipped a little bit with like David and Achish, right? Because that just kind of sets up the scene, if you will. Because I already talked about that, right? That David had become so popular with Achish, and him and Achish are basically best buddies, and Achish wants him to be like his bodyguard forever, right? So now we jump to Saul, and Saul is basically like he's ready to go to battle against the Philistines, but he sees how powerful they've become, and I'm thinking here, of course, the Bible doesn't really tell us, but it's safe to assume that because of Saul's negligence to the throne, I mean, he's been chasing David around for all this time, and of course, even in the year that David's been gone, he still has probably been looking for him, right? And so, Saul in his obsession has probably neglected his duties, and the power of the Philistines has kind of crept up behind him, right? And so now the Philistines have become extremely powerful, right? And the Philistines have amassed what they need to fight Israel. They're ready to fight Israel after all this time, right? Because sure, like, there have been skirmishes between Israel and the Philistines, as we've read, but not any full-out war, right? Because the Philistines weren't quite powerful enough. But now they have, in this year that, the Bible kind of does this time jump, right? The Philistines have now become powerful enough. And Saul has seen how powerful they become, and now he's afraid of them. I, I, I'm pretty sure, once again, this is more speculation, but due to Saul's negligence, he has probably not kept Israel as strong, right? Israel's not as strong. It's probably fallen to, it's probably become like militarily, like its military strength has become kind of weak because of Saul's negligence to his military duties, and so that's come to basically bite Saul in the ass now, right now, and he's afraid. He doesn't know what to do. So of course he tries to ask God, and God's like, "I'm not talking to you," right? So God's giving attitude, I guess. And so Saul does, I guess, the next best thing. And so he wants to call up the spirit of Samuel. But, it begs the question, though, if, like, God has already stopped talking to you, what makes you think, well, okay, I can actually guess what makes Saul think that, raising up Samuel and, talking to his spirit would actually have, can get some guidance, right? Because, of course, once again, this is one of those things that the Bible doesn't really tell us, but it's safe to assume that, like, Samuel and Saul were friends, and they were pretty good friends once upon a time, right? I mean, Samuel was the one who anointed him as king and all that, right? And then, of course, when Saul, in his earlier years, was probably a good king, Samuel was, a major influence in Saul's life, and they were probably, not just was Samuel a good influence, but they were probably good friends, and so Saul is thinking that his friend will talk to him, right? His friend will talk to him, but of course Samuel's dead, right? And he's been dead for a while, right? Because it's kind of funny how chapter 28 kind of brings up the fact again, in case you forgot that Samuel was already dead halfway through his own book. Chapter 28 gives you a nice reminder that it's like, yeah, we're halfway through the book of Samuel. Well, first and second Samuel, we're kind of in the midpoint. We're telling you Samuel's dead, right? In case you didn't catch it earlier, right? And so now there's no real way of Samuel and Saul really talking. Of course, then Saul resorts to finding a spirit medium or a necromancer, basically. And so a person who communes with the dead, right? And so he's going to consult one and see if he can bring up the spirit of Samuel. Now, what's interesting is when they find this like medium, but she's probably been out of a job for like forever, right? Because she mentions that, like, well, King Saul drove us out years ago, right? And the implication was probably like when Saul was in his good years, so basically before David entered the scene, which, remember, by this time has actually been a very long time, right? Because I think the time span between like Saul starting to lose, favor with God and this point in the end of the book of Samuel, it's probably been like 15, 20 years, give or take. Or sorry, no, let's backtrack a bit. So David is like 16 when he shows up in the story. Now the Bible says he becomes king when he's 30 in 2 Samuel. Sorry, I'm kind of getting my timeline mixed up here. So, because I was going to say that the necromancers have probably been, out of a job, if you will, for like 20 some odd years, roughly, right? Because at this point, like, David's probably like in his mid-20s. Because David actually, if you read 2 Samuel, if you read ahead, David doesn't become king till he's about 30. And by then, it had already been like four years or something like that since Saul died. It's been like a couple of years, but not too many. So we'll say like 5 years, roughly 5 years. So here, that means roughly at this time, David's about 25. So it's only been 10 years since, like, David showed up on the scene, right? In chapter 16 and to chapter 28, where we are now, it's roughly a 10-year time jump, right? Well, not time jump, we do see some events, but it's been roughly 10 years, right? And the assumption is that before those 10 years, before David showed up on the scene, when Saul was being a relatively decent king and doing his job and all that, right? He had driven out the spirit mediums and the spiritist, right? As the medium kind of tells him, right? It's like, well, King Saul drove us out years ago, right? I mean, so that's kind of, it's kind of interesting that like they still find this woman, right? Because if she's been out of a job for like at the very shortest like 11 years, and I'm gonna think like probably on the longer part, you're like 20 years, and this woman's been out of a job for like 20 years. So like, how would anyone know to find like that she was a spirit medium, let alone where to find her, right? I don't know. It's just one of those weird things. And of course, now there's this interesting scene. Now that we're talking about this spiritist, right? And there's a scene where Saul asks her to bring up the spirit of Samuel, right? And she, does her incantations or whatever. And then there's this weird moment where, Saul's like, well, what do you see? And then the woman like starts freaking out. And she's like, I see a man coming out of the ground. And he looks like an old dude in a robe. And then Saul like knows it's Samuel. Now this scene is very interesting because there's two ways that this scene is interpreted, right? First of all, right, if this woman was a necromancer, and if Saul drove them out because they're you're not, you read in like Leviticus, there should be no necromancers among you, right? You have to stone, kill sorcerers and whatever, right? Like there ought to be none of this kind of stuff among your people. And so we have this scene with this spiritist, and this is kind of this weird thing happens where Samuel's spirit does show up. Now there are two ways that this passage is interpreted. One of them is, the first way is supposedly, a lot of Bible scholars accept this view more because it one doesn't it doesn't make the Bible seem as awkward, and it doesn't like bring up other like problems, if you will, of how we read the Bible. And the first way of interpreting it is that the idea of the woman actually being a necromancer is actually not true. She's not really like someone who can call spirits of the dead. Now the evidence for this is the idea that the woman freaks out when she sees the ghost, right? And many a Bible scholar would say that, well, she freaks out because she's never actually seen a ghost, right? Perhaps this whole time, she's actually like a charlatan, right? She's more like a stage magician, if you will, kind of necromancer, right? So she's a fake, right? And you think of this is one scene I was thinking about, like, you ever watch Young Justice? It's a TV show, and it's kind of based on like, the sidekick heroes in DC Comics, so like Robin, Aqualad, Kid Flash, and those guys, right? So, and you watch in one of the early episodes. This was like years ago when the show came out, and there's a scene where Kent Nelson. Now you don't know who Kent Nelson is. He's basically he's the most popular version of Doctor Fate, who's like the Sorcerer Supreme in the DC universe. But anyway, so Ken Nelson, he wants to, commune with his wife Inza. You can see where this is going, right? The Sorcerer Supreme wants to commune with his long gone wife Inza. So he goes to the spirit medium, and she uh, starts doing this whole thing, right? And um, communing with the spirits, and then like Ken starts laughing at her, right? The spirit medium that he meets, he starts laughing at her because he's like, "You call yourself a spirit medium? Like, come on!" Like, and then he like shows the fan under the table, and like he like kind of shows some of the like other props that this woman uses for her like little show when she's like doing her spirit medium stuff, right? And basically, Doctor Fate. I mean, if he's the Sorcerer Supreme, he knows magic. But like, Kent Nelson's kind of like making fun of this woman because she thinks she's like the real deal, but it's like, yeah, you're just a fake, right? You're not, you're not a real magician or anything like that, right? And so it's kind of like that, right? Where this woman here in the Book of Samuel, she might have been like a fake, right? But then this brings up a weird kind of question, then, right? If she's a fake, then how did this happen, right? How did the spirit of Samuel actually show up? And of course, you run into one major problem when we're reading through the Bible, and a lot of things that people wouldn't think about God. But I mean, you're watching the streaming Parson, so I'm obviously gonna break expectations here. But like the idea that God is kind of playing a practical joke on Saul, right? Because the fact that Saul constantly is trying to seek guidance from God, and then goes to a necromancer of all places, right? And then God decides to play a joke on him, right? By actually bringing Samuel's spirit. God plays a joke on him by actually bringing Samuel's spirit. Now, the problem with this interpretation, of course, is that it makes God look really mean, right? He's really mean to Saul. And, sure, Samuel could give excuses, quote unquote, of like, why God would act in a very mean fashion, right? Of course, this is a problematic way of reading it, because then if you read it with that interpretation, then God seems like a really mean person here, right? That, first he's not talking to Saul, and when Saul goes through desperate measures, God plays it off as a big joke, right? And kind of just trolls the guy, right? In a very serious situation, right? And God kind of treats it like a joke. And that kind of, and some people would make the argument that makes God look really mean. And, I can buy that argument, right? It does kind of make him look really mean, right? Of course, you can give your excuses of like, well, no, God's not being that mean. I mean, Saul had it coming, Saul should have just learned to take no for an answer, right? Saul, God also requires consent. You can't just ask him for things whenever you want to, you could give those kind of excuses, but um, you can't get, but of course at the same time, you can't get away from the fact that it does look really mean for God to do this to Saul. If we go with the interpretation that, the woman's a fake, and then God decided to play a joke on everybody by actually making a spirit appear. Of course, like I said earlier, the evidence of her being a fake is that she freaks out when she actually sees the ghost, right? Because if she was a real necromancer, right, then this wouldn't be anything new to her. She would have seen ghosts before, right? That's what necromancers do. so so the likelihood of her being a fake is actually pretty high, right? Hey, male, welcome to the stream. So basically, yeah, it makes her look like it's the most popular theory, but it does have that gaping problem, right? The so TLDR, most likely she was a fake, but then God actually brought a spirit just to play a joke on everybody. But the gaping problem with this is that it makes God look really mean, right? Because he decides to play a big joke on Saul. And yeah, we could try and justify that, oh, Saul's kind of been a real dickbag, so he kind of had it coming. But at the same time, people would also flip that around and say, well, but God is God. He's obviously above that, right? Like, just because Saul's kind of a dickbag does not justify God of all people, to play a joke on him like that, right? And in a way embarrass him, right? Because that's basically what God does. He embarrasses Saul, right? And then, of course, the stuff Samuel says to him is really cutting, right? And, Samuel's like, what the hell, man? Like, why'd you bring me up here, right? Like, let me just rest in peace, dude. Why can't you just accept that you're gonna die, right? Like, basically is what Samuel tells him, right? And then Samuel's like, all right, I'm going back to my grave now. Like, see you later. And so, I mean, Samuel's just salt to the wound, right? But that, I can see that being a huge problem for people, of like God being really mean that way. But of course, the second interpretation is also really problematic. Of course, the second interpretation is less likely because of the reasons I've gave before. That when the woman freaks out when she sees the ghost, she probably isn't a real necromancer. Because then we run into another problem if she really was a necromancer. So the second interpretation is that she actually successfully summons his spirit, right? Which then people would ask, well, why would she freak out then? If she's a necromancer, she's obviously seen spirits before. So, but if she did successfully bring up his spirit, well then, what does that say about, the time when people, what happens to people when they die, right? And this brings up all kinds of problems. Now, the Catholic Church has actually come up with some kind of answer. They've tried to explain this. And so, in the Catholic worldview, they believe that, like, basically before Jesus, everybody went to hell. And because there was no way out of it, right? All human beings were hellbound before Jesus came. And so everybody went to hell. And that was signified by going into, the underworld, right? And of course, Greek philosophy modified this idea, and that's where we get Hades from, right? And so everybody goes to the underworld. And so Samuel is no exception. Even though he's a prophet of God, because this is pre-Jesus, he also goes to the underworld. Everybody goes there. And, the necromancer has the ability to pull people out there for a time, right? That's how communing with the dead works. And so, but if that were the case, we run into its own problem, right? That, how could this woman, this necromancer, who would be viewed as an evil person according to the Jewish law, have the ability or the authority to draw out someone like Samuel, right? I mean, I guess you could give the explanation that because, the dead people, the dead don't really have any real power, right? Then you can pull anyone from the nether, right? I mean, that's the fantasy novel's way of going about it, right? Of course, that runs with its own problems, right? And so, then why doesn't this happen a lot more frequently, right? And of course, why doesn't the Bible bring this up more often, right? But of course, this is an acceptable interpretation because you can ask the question, or let me put it this way: it would answer questions found in older parts of the Bible, right? Like, why should sorcerers and necromancers be put to death, right? As is, God commands, and I should probably look it up, like to give you the actual verse, but like in Leviticus, God does point out that like necromancers be put to death. And if stuff like that was all fake, like as some Bible scholars tend to view, like any magic found in the Bible, anyone doing like witchcraft and stuff, a lot of Bible scholars tend to view them as being, they're all fake. But then, of course, that runs into its own problem, right? Then why would God ever give the Israelites commands to kill these people, right? But if we go with the interpretation that this woman actually is a necromancer and summons Samuel's spirit, then it would justify other laws that would make God seem kind of mean, right? So it's kind of funny to look at it this way. If the woman was a fake necromancer, then God looks really mean. If the woman actually possesses supernatural powers and can summon the dead, then it actually makes God look really nice. It's kind of a weird, ironic twist, if you will. But those are the two ways that many people, the people can read this passage. Of course, like I said earlier, because of certain stuff within the book of Samuel's text, more people accept the first interpretation, that the woman is actually a fake and that she's not a real necromancer. But then how did Samuel's spirit got there? Well, the only way would be that God did it and not through the woman's power. But if God was the one who brought Samuel, then that makes God look really mean, because then Samuel just making fun of, or not making fun, but Samuel basically like condemning Saul to his death, that just makes God look really mean. But if the woman were an actual necromancer and brought up his spirit, and then Samuel's reaction would be a very natural reaction. And so to the opposite, it would be God is really nice, because I mean, what do you think would happen if you drew up someone's spirit when they would be otherwise resting in peace, right? Like, who do you think, like, I'd be pretty mad too, right? Think of it like that, right? If you were, if you had died and you were resting in peace, right? And then someone drew out your spirit just to talk to you, you'd be pretty mad too, right? You'd be like, what are you doing? Like, let me just, like, could I just have my peace in death, right? Like, you would think that, right? And so Samuel being angry is just a more natural reaction of Samuel. And therefore, God does not at all participate in this scene. And then by extension, it actually makes God look really nice, because he's, God's not playing this big joke on everybody. So that's what makes this chapter a really interesting chapter, right? Because this weird event does happen. And how are we supposed to make out of it, right? As far as the way I read it, I go with I'm willing to go with the first interpretation and deal with the more honest reality that God is pretty mean in this scene, right? And I was like, well, that's an interesting thing for a Christian pastor to think, but like, I mean, come on, this is streaming Parson, man. Have you watched my other videos, right? Like, there are moments where God can be pretty outright mean, right? To be fair, I'm trying to rectify this idea that, like, well, since God is a person, he has real emotions like that, right? And that's where some people will say, like, well, how come God can be wrathful, right? God can be a lot of things, because he's, in a way, he's a person, right? And the way that we should view it, as I've talked about in like Genesis multiple times, is that, like, it's not so much that God behaves like a person, but rather we as people, because we're made in the image of God, we act like God. And so things like being able to be angry at things that are bad, or being vindictive of things, is not so much of like a wrong thing, because God feels those things. So it's more us acting like God, as opposed to God sinking to human levels. So here, for God to kind of act kind of mean, I wouldn't put it outside his character, right? Like, of course people say, but God is supposed to be loving, God is, he's all loving and all that, but it's like, well, God has moments where clearly in the Old Testament he can be pretty mean, right? Like killing the firstborn of Egypt, when God is being the Grim Reaper. I don't think it gets any more mean than that, right? Like, that's as mean gets, right? God is super mean in that scene, right? He's the Grim Reaper, right? So, like, this is kind of child's play if you put that in comparison and you put that perspective, right? And I have no problem viewing it this way, because that actually makes God more realistic, right? And of course, I think one of the biggest counter arguments when people say, oh, well, God can't exist because of, like, he does stuff like this, is like, well, no, that makes him more realistic, because then he behaves like anyone else, right? And I can believe in a God that can do things that people can do, right? Of course, I know some people would view that problem as, well, but humans are sinful and God is not sinful, which is true. But once again, sin is us twisting, you know, the ways of God, if you will, and really playing God ourselves, right? After all, the Greek word that we get the word sin from, sinos, means like missing the mark, right? So most Christians understand that to be like, or at least the way most Christians should understand that. I don't know if I've met many a funny Christian character, but the way we should view it is that like we try to act like God. After all, monkey see, monkey do. But because we are not God, we cannot do what God can do, right? And so when God is showing his vindictive side at times, when we try to be vindictive, we tend to be a lot more, you know, we tend to do it for more selfish reasons, right? Which, of course, you could say, well, when God does it, it's obviously for selfish reasons. But, when we do it for our own vengeance, right, then we are playing God, right? And that is where we cross the line, right? When we play God and how we decide who gets, you know, our wrath, right? So it's not the idea that we have wrath is what makes us sinful, but rather that we think we can decide who gets to be the victims of our wrath, and we choose that, right? Of course, ultimately, you know, this is where the religio idea of like God decides who lives and who dies, right? Which is like the ultimate example between life and death. But you can look at the lower levels, like, okay, who deserves to deal with my anger and who does not, right? Who do I get to, you know, show my mean side to, right? And stuff like that, right? Of course, us as people, we don't get to decide that, right? We don't get to just say, well, I can be mean to you, you, and you just because I want to be, right? But with that said, though, because I view as like, okay, when we do certain things, it's us trying to imitate God but failing. With that worldview, I guess you could say that I have, then it's more acceptable when I read moments like this in the book of Samuel, and I don't think there's a continuity error, and I don't think that like, well, God acting mean here is actually a bad thing, but rather it's a pretty normal thing because and you can throw your consent jokes in here, uh, but Saul should learn that no means no, right? If God doesn't want to talk to you, you don't force God to talk to you, because then he's gonna be mean about it. And playing a joke like this is one way of doing it, right? So that could be a way to work around it, right? Which I know some people might not like that rationale, but I mean it seems it's logical. So I think that's one way it could go about. Holy moly! I can't believe I've been talking about this one chapter for like almost an hour. Because I mean, to be fair, chapter 20 is a really interesting chapter. It's just it's interesting because there's so much to talk about it because it's just so out there, right? Which I think is what makes it so interesting. Like chapter 20 is there is no other there I don't think there's any other like part of the Bible that's like this. It's so bizarre. And I think that's why people have problems when they look at like God being mean in the scene. Because I mean, minus the whole Grim Reaper thing in Exodus, there's no scene like God never does anything like this again. We never see him do anything like this, right? Other than like the Grim Reaper scenes, right? Or like, okay, when people say like, well, I would also associate this with like Grim Reaper scenes, right? That's what I'm calling them now, just because it sounds edgy and cool. But like, you know, when he floods the world in Genesis, or when he's destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, he's basically being the Grim Reaper. And so, like, outside of those moments, we don't really see God do stuff like this, right? And so that's why some people have problems. And this is one of, I mean, to be fair though, right? Like, we don't, like, this is not a story you read in Sunday school. Hey, today in Sunday school, we're going to do the story of Saul meets the necromancer. What's a necromancer? Right? Yeah, that'd be a great discussion for Sunday school. But like, but yeah, I mean, this is a bizarre story. So like, read chapter 28 again because it is out there, and I mean, we could keep talking about it, but for the sake of wanting to move through this stream and get this done, we're gonna stop talking about it because I honestly could keep going and keep laughing about how ridiculous this scene is because it is out there. And then, of course, now that I've read chapter 28, everything afterwards is going to seem like kind of boring in comparison. But, I mean, you can kind of view chapter 28 as at this climax moment, right? Where, like, Saul is confronted with his fate, right? Which is interesting now that I bring that up, right? Is that, like, this idea of fate, right? Of course, like, you know, many people say, well, isn't the Christian worldview more about free will, right? Because, you know, you can choose to believe in God or not, right? That's kind of the Christian idea. So we're more like quote unquote free will. But then where does fate fit into this, right? And so, you know, the way that the Bible paints it here is that because Saul had chosen all these decisions in life, his decisions go somewhere, right? Because of course that's real life, right? Your your actions have consequences. And you have to face those consequences, right? And that's kind of how the Bible treats like fate, right? So yes, we do choose our fate in the sense that there is free will, but at the same time, when the results come, you cannot escape it. Which I think is like, I mean, most secular people believe that to be true. I mean, it's not a uniquely Christian idea. I mean, it's just something that's like a universal thing, right? I mean, that's just, you could just say like that's how God programmed the universe, right? That's one way of looking at it, right? God programmed the universe that way. So if we make a series of decisions, then when the outcomes of those decisions come, you cannot escape them. You must face them, right? Good and bad, right? You must face them. So that's all I have to say about chapter 28. And boy howdy, that was a lot. But to be fair, and like I've said before, this one's out there. Because now we're going to reach chapter 29, and it's going to be nothing as exciting. It's going to be kind of tame, actually. It's going to be kind of boring, actually, now. Just, like, start off the stream with a bang, and then, like, the rest of the Book of Samuel is kind of like, yeah. It's kind of boring. Because, I mean, it doesn't get better than a necromancer scene. And it really doesn't. But chapter 29, here we go. So the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands. David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. And the commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" And Achish replied, "Is this not David, who is an officer of... Is this not David, who was an officer of King Saul of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have not found fault in him." I don't know why I changed Achish's voice like that, but that's what we're going with. But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place where you assigned him. You must not go out with us onto the battlefield, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor and by taking the heads of our own men. Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So Achish called David and said to him, As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace, and do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. But what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? And Achish answered, I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, He must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early along your master's servants whom you've come with, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. See, compared to chapter 28, that was like pretty boring. So basically, the Philistines are getting ready to fight. And, you know, one of those leaders would be Achish, right? And Achish has David as his bodyguard. And the other Philistines are just like, wait, what? Why is this guy here? Isn't this guy like our arch enemy? Why is he here? Yeah, we're not bringing him along. Like, that's like the ultimate chance for him to like kill us all, right? And you know, in a funny way, the Philistines were probably right. It's kind of funny how like, you know, I guess just logic dictates, right? But you know, they're probably right that like, no, this is the opportune time for him to kill us all, right? We're not bringing him because he's gonna kill us. I mean, this is the same David that people sing about, that he's killed tens of thousands of people. Yeah, we don't want this guy here, right? And so it's just kind of funny that like the Philistines are right here, right? And you kind of totally get where they're at. I totally get what they're at. I wouldn't bring a guy like, you know, if I was invading a guy's, you know, invading someone's country, I wouldn't bring like their celebrity along, right? Like, yeah, not gonna happen. And Achish, you know, Achish is funny because like I don't like Achish is probably pretty stupid, probably too many drinks or something, right? But like, you know, the Bible does tell us David is like a saboteur, right? Like he's been raiding Philistine towns, and Achish suspects nothing, right? Of course, like David lies to the guy because David does have his scumbaggy moments like that, but you know, Achish suspects nothing, right? Whereas like these Philistine guys, they have every right to be like, kind of don't want this guy here, right? Kind of making me feel uneasy that David, this Hebrew, is hanging around us when we're gonna go fight some Hebrews. Kind of sus, you know, like David's the Red Among Us character, right? That's David in a nutshell. And yeah, that's kind of the chapter, right? They tell Achish, we don't want this guy here. Send him home, right? Get him away from here. And so Achish is just like, yeah, sorry, guy. You know, maybe we'll have some drinks when we get back, but you can't come with us. The other guys don't want you here. And you know, all their votes over mine. So yeah, I didn't win that one, so you gotta go home now. Dave's like, okay. Because, you know, the Philistines are probably right. Because, as I mentioned before, you know, David wouldn't want to fight Saul anyway, right? Because of his whole respect for him. So, yeah, it is more than likely if David had gone, he'd have killed all the Philistines from the back line, right? But of course, with everything that was said in chapter 28 by, the ghost of Samuel, this may have been like, you know, God using the Philistines, if you will, to carry out his will against Saul, right? And so David would not be Saul's rescuer, which is interesting, right? Because this is a thing I've kind of thought about, and take this with a grain of salt. This is how I'm interpreting, the revelation God gave Samuel, and paralleling David with Jesus for a moment. So here's what I'm thinking. Since David is not, he's not the Messiah, so God does not have him have this moment where he could be that Messiah figure for someone who's fallen so far, right? Which is ultimately the message of the gospel, that Jesus is that figure for even the worst of us, right? If we choose to believe in him. Now, David here could have been that messianic figure for someone like Saul, right? Whether that would change Saul, we don't know. But the potential was there. And so if David had gone to this battle and he killed the Philistines, and saved Saul from the fate, if you will, that was already assigned to him. Now, of course, this is one of the central themes of Christianity, is that because we all have sin in our lives, we are all hellbound. That is our fate, in a way, right? With all the choices we make, and more often than not, because humans are humans and humans are crap, we will more often than not choose a sinful route, and because God cannot be around sin, that means he'll have to separate himself from us, which is ultimately what hell is. So, by definition, then, the fate of all human beings is hell. So, this is where the story of the gospel comes in, right? That Jesus died on the cross for all of us, so that would not be our fate, right? If we choose to believe in him, that choice can overturn all the other choices, and thus we can be redeemed and pulled out of the hellbound fate and join God in a new relationship, which can bring us to the new life, and basically new heaven, new earth, right? As Revelation would describe it. So that's how the redemptive story ultimately works. That's as the gospel tells it. And the dynamic that we're supposed to view it is that, like, well, we all are all pretty awful, right? Because if we are introspective and actually, look at ourselves more honestly and don't try and justify the bad things we do as good, we all know that we are all actually pretty bad, right? Because we're ultimately selfish. We will go out of our ways to hurt. We will go out of our way to hurt others, right? If it benefits us and stuff like that, because humans are humans and humans are crap. So God decides to overturn this by sending Jesus. And so, in believing in him, we can be moved out of that fate of, the hellbound fate. Now, we look at Saul and David, right? They're rivals. Similar to how, in the book of Romans, Paul talks about this. We're like, well, we were enemies of God, right? And in the same way, Saul and David have this dynamic, this rebellious dynamic, right? That one, they rebel against each other, if you will, right? And there's of course that like kingship and king and subject kind of dynamic, and that's also true between like us and God. So, since this is not the gospel, right? This is the story of David, a precursor, if you will, of understanding the gospel. Then you have to see this scene in that light, right? What's happening here in chapter 29. And so David is not given the opportunity to deliver Saul, right? Because once again, you have to understand that the main theme of the book of Samuel is that only God can be king. Only God can ultimately do that, right? Because once again, there's also the flip possibility, right? If David were to save Saul, Saul could immediately turn on him. And of course, all David's actions would be for nothing. And so there's that possibility as well. And so when we look at David and Saul's dynamic here, and David potentially being able to save him, the way that in Christianese we would say that, like, well, God used the Philistines to prevent that from happening, and so God assigned Saul to that fate. And since there is no quote unquote Christ moment here, Saul is not given a way out, right? Whereas the gospel message is that we are all given a way out, right? And that is through the person of Jesus Christ. But when we read about Saul here and the end of his part of the story of the book of Samuel, we end First Samuel as Saul will be consigned to his fate. And so God does not give him an out here, and uses the Philistines to prevent David from giving him that out. Now, of course, there's another thing that's also going to be played out in 2 Samuel, that David cannot be a messianic figure in that sense, right? Because only God can be that person. No one can be that. David, as great as he is, included, right? David cannot be Saul's salvation. And so this is interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here of, like, this is an interesting way that for us to understand the gospel message. And many people would say, like, that's a weird kind of stretch, but at the same time, I guess when you've been reading the Bible as many times as I have, and if the Bible's primary purpose is to lead us toward the person of God, ultimately through Jesus Christ, then you have to be able to see how the Bible wants to reveal Christ at any given moment, even in weird ass chapters like this, right? Even in weird chapters like this. And so that's what I'm seeing in chapter 29. And once again, a lot of this is like me, and this is one of those, like, interesting, like, things that, like, when you read the Bible for so long, and you make a daily part of your life, these kind of like, you're entering into my weird world of thinking right now, right? I'm letting you guys pick my brain a bit here, I guess, or rather, I'm picking my brain for you. But, like, it's kind of these kind of things I think about as I read through the Bible a lot, and it makes you wonder, right? And it makes you also appreciate other things more too, right? And so chapter 29 that's what makes it kind of interesting. I mean, once again, I mean, in comparison to the Necromancer chapter, I don't think this is as awesome, but, like, it still gets the brain juices going. It makes you think about, like, why didn't God allow David to, like, save Saul or whatever? And there might be other I gave what my reasoning was, and there could be other reasons too, but just something really interesting to think about. And it's one of the things. It's one of those things that makes the Bible rich to read. And this is also a skill I hope to have you guys kind of learn as you guys watch me do it. Is that, like, to really think about the text and read in between the lines and try and see bigger pictures, being painted within the text. And that's kind of what I was doing chapter 20, because honestly, if I wasn't doing that, chapter 29 would be over. It's kind of not much else to it, right? Chapter 30. Let's move on. We're near the end. So, chapter 30. David and his men reach Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off and went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives, sons, and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. So David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. Now David was greatly distressed because the men were talking about stoning him, and each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." And Abiathar brought it to him. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party, and will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." So David and the 600 men that came with him came to Besor Valley, where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley. But David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water and food, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. And he ate and was revived, for he had not eaten anything for 3 days and 3 nights. And David asked them, "Who do you belong to? Where do you come from?" And the man said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I had become ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." And David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." So he led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day. So basically fought them like almost 24 hours. And none of them got away, except for the 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. Now David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. I mean, I would accept for maybe some food that the Amalekites ate, but that's about it. David brought everything back. Verse 20. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder!" Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and were left behind at the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. And as David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they didn't go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." And David replied, "No. You must not do that with what the Lord has given to us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say anyway? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to battle. All will share alike." So David made this statute an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." Now David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth, Negev, and Jatir, To those in Aror, Sitmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rachel. To those in the towns of Jeremielites and the Kenites. And to those in Horman, or Hormah, Borashan, Athak, and Hebron. And to those in all the other places that he and his men roamed. So chapter 30, David goes back to Ziklag and finds out that the place had been burned down. So I guess, one way of looking at it is that like God used the Philistines to send David back so that he could fight the Amalekites, right? Because, of course, there's an interesting twist to this, right? Of course, who is the raiding party? It's the Amalekites. And if you remember who the Amalekites were, these people were supposed to already be dead. Because when God commanded Saul, way back in chapter like 15 or whatever, to kill the Amalekites and to kill all of them, and Saul didn't do it, here they are, causing problems again. And so the interesting thing here is that, like, well, David is kind of gonna, how will David be a better king than Saul? It's kind of what the story is painting here. Because after all, we're approaching the end of 1 Samuel, right? Saul's time is coming to an end. We read in 28 that he is assigned to his fate, right? And a crappy one at that. So how will David fare? Perhaps David will fare better, right? He fights Amalekites without, with reckless abandon, right? He's going to carry out God's will to deal with these people, right? David's going to be a great king when he does, right? Because we know he's going to be when Saul is going to, meet his fate. That Samuel told him back in chapter 28, that Saul and his sons will all die. But David here, he shows promise, right? And, he inquires of the Lord, and unlike Saul, God hears and answers David. David is successful in his battle, which will be a big turn, which will be a big twist over, what we read with Saul, what's going to happen to him in the next chapter, right? David is met with success. So we'll see what happens, right? David's got promise. But, spoiler alert, and, you've watched my other videos, you know that I have dubbed the Book of Samuel a tale of two bad kings. So that should already tell you a lot. But, chapter 30 does tries to paint this picture of, like, and tries to keep the audience in suspense of, like, how will David fare, right? Of course, I did give the spoiler, but if you were going through the Bible for the very first time on your own, that's how the narration would work, right? It would work like, we've seen that Saul was, the first king, and he did not do so hot. And now Saul is assigned to his fate. How will David fare? Find out in the next book, right? Like, I had to kind of make it sound epic like that at the end. Like those TV shows, when they try to preview the next or like end the current episode on a cliffhanger, and then like, the way of like, we're ending this episode on a cliffhanger. Watch the next one to find out what happened, right? And so that's kind of what chapter 30 is about, right? Find out next time, and starting next week as I read through 2 Samuel, right? See how David will do as king, right? And that's kind of what chapter 30 does, right? And chapter 30 shows promise in David. He's got promise, right? I mean, he's had that for a while, right? Since, we met him back in chapter 16, and especially in chapter 17 and 18 with the Goliath story, right? David shows promise. And chapter 30 is just a reminder of that, right? We've got promise, right? So tune in and find out what happens. And, you got to think about how, like, even though, of course, at the time when people were probably reading this, Israel had already gone through the exilic period, with the Babylonian exile. in like 500 some odd BC, right? Since Israel had already gone through that, they'd be reading like a much older story. I mean, I guess in our case, it's a really old story, but as they go through the story, they obviously would kind of treat, like the Bard's Tale style. And I've mentioned that the Book of Samuel does the Bard Tale style, right? So you have to imagine that they were telling these stories to each other, and you get to chapter 30, and you're kind of doing like the next time on Dragon Ball Z kind of thing, right? And so that's kind of how you should read chapter 30, right? Even though I'm kind of just jumping around here and there and reading the Bible holistically. But as you read through First Samuel and you get to chapter 30, and you keep the Bard's Tale motif in mind, you're supposed to read it as if like, yeah, this is like the preview of the next book, right? Chapter 30 is the preview. Because chapter 31 is how we end, Saul's tale. Which, we're just going to read through chapter 31. And after chapter 31, it will be the end. So, stream's not going to be that long today, but, I mean, most of these reading streams aren't that long anyway. And I don't have much else to say about chapter 30. I mean, it's just an event chapter, right? David fights some Amalekites. He beats them up, gets his stuff back, goes home. They start rebuilding, I guess, because Ziklag is all gone, right? Got torched, so they gotta rebuild, right? So David just goes home, and then we'll see what comes for David coming in 2 Samuel, because he'll be back then, right? But before we read what happens with David and what's going to happen to him, we have to read, Saul meets his fate that he's already been told of back in chapter 28. So now we are in chapter 31. So now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run through me, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and wouldn't do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that Israelites' army had fled, and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their gods and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of Ashtoreth and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons off the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they buried them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So yeah, That's the end of chapter 31. That is the end of 1 Samuel. Saul dies in a pretty anticlimactic way. He kills himself. Which is interesting to read here because, I mean, we're not in feudal Japan, but obviously the idea of seppuku is still kind of a thing around, right? Saul committed seppuku. Um, basically is what he did. But of course, when you think about how brutal the ancient world was, you really realize that seppuku is a really way better option than a lot of things, right? For those of you who don't know what seppuku is basically the Bushido idea of when you are beaten in battle or something, and instead of facing quote unquote dishonor, you take your own life so that you could still be honorable in death. And actually, the Bible does point out that that's exactly the idea of seppuku here. That's why Saul does it, because you think of like, how do I put it? You think of, okay, let me backtrack a bit. So Saul commits seppuku, and the idea is that he wants to maintain honor in his death. And I remember when I was doing a Bible study, and we were reading this chapter. Yeah, I know, weird, right? We're reading this in a Bible study, but I mean, it's a guy's Bible study, and we read all the weird crap, right? So we were reading this part when Saul is talking to the armor bearer. Saul kills himself, right? Saul first asks the armor bearer to do it, which is actually how seppuku actually goes down, right? Well, in more formalized seppuku. So first, Saul wants to do a formal form of seppuku where someone else kills you, right? And you consent to them killing you because you order them to kill you, right? So he tries to get the armor bearer to commit seppuku, for him, right? But of course, it's interesting that this guy refuses to do it, right? Because maybe he learned something from David or something in the time David spared him or something. But this armor bearer, refuses to do it, right? He won't touch the Lord's anointed. And then Saul tries to tell him, like, look, man, if we're still alive at the end of this, it's gonna get really bad for us. Because, and in a guy's Bible study, we're gonna bring these up because we're guys. And I remember someone brought up, like, there's a wordplay here, actually, right? And I know the NIV tones it down a bit because, warning, we're going to some serious subject matter here, and unpleasant conversation topic is coming up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So Saul says, in some versions, like the English Standard Version, Saul will say, and in some verse, where is it? Trying to find it. Okay, so this is verse 4. And Saul says to his armor bearer, draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me. So, in some versions, instead of the run me through, the word is used as thrust. Now, I know what you're all thinking, and it's exactly what you think it is, right? And the wording here is very important, right? Because he's telling the guy to commit seppuku, right? To kill him. And so the seppuku illustration, I'm using seppuku as the illustration here, it's very clear that Saul is commanding the armor bearer to, for them to do seppuku. But then when he uses the same kind of words of like thrust or run through, the second time he uses it, it's a very different meaning, right? And it's obviously when the Bible does it this way, and I'm happy the translators tried to maintain this as best as they could. In a way, this is actually what makes English an interesting language, because you can actually do wordplay like this really well. So when Saul says, "Run me through," right, and they're talking about seppuku, then he says, or these uncircumcised fellows, which gives you the context, right? Because we're talking about uncircumcision, right? Or circumcision, uncircumcision. We're talking about, which exactly what we're talking about. And as soon as you bring that up and you bring up the words run through again, obviously we're not talking about seppuku anymore. We're talking about, the RAPE, right? And so basically, and then that is continued when Saul continues by saying they will run me through and abuse me. So the implication is that Saul is still alive. So what do you think is gonna happen? What do you think Saul is talking about, right? He's obviously, talking about, the RAPE, right? So there's obviously, and it's actually pretty brilliant that the English can actually do wordplay like that, right? In an English standard version, it uses like thrust me, else these uncircumcised Philistines will thrust me and abuse me or whatever, right? And so I know all you guys think with your thrusting jokes. Oh, I thought it too, so I can't shame you for thinking it. Because I mean, I remember when I was doing the Bible study, we kind of were talking about that. It's like, is this a wordplay? This is obviously a wordplay, isn't it? It's like, yes, it is, right? And yes, it's exactly what you think it is. But when Saul accepts his death, right, and he's already considered like, well, it's over, right? So let me commit seppuku to at least maintain some honor in my death, right? Of course, then I mean these, as Saul correctly kind of suggests, is these Philistines are pretty awful, right? I mean, what do they do to a dead person's body? They don't just leave it, right? They strip him of the armor, they cut off his head, and then they hang the body at like some wall, right? Just for like people to laugh at. That's Saul's dead body hanging over there, right? Like it's kind of messed up, that people do that, right? Imagine if people did that today. Like that, I mean, we view that as extremely barbaric, right? Like imagine if like, well, actually, you don't actually have to really imagine it because this actually still happens in some places in the world, right? Because you know, Christian brothers and sisters have their bodies hanged after they've been executed in like parts of the Middle East, right? Because it's a crime to be a Christian there. So they will be killed, and then their bodies are kind of hanged around, right? As like decoration, right? The dead bodies of Christians as decorations, right? It's a real thing, right? Um, Obviously, don't look it up because it is really disturbing. And with that being said, um, the ancient world is pretty cruel, right? Because even after like Saul commits seppuku to at least have some honor in his death, the Philistines treat his body with no respect whatsoever, right? Strip the armor, chop off the head, and hang the body, right? And so, these it's pretty gruesome in the ancient world. And then of course, like, you know, there's some faithful Hebrews are like, no man should ever have to do this, right? No man should ever have this happen to them. And so they claim Saul's body, they take it from the wall, and they bury him, right? Because that's the least you can offer someone, right? And that's a reality of war and how ugly ancient world war is, and war in general, but especially in the ancient world, right? And that's why, like, if you ever watch like in movies and they romanticize wars where like some when two people fight and they kill each other, like they have to kill each other, and they try to make this agreement of like, look, let the loser have a proper burial, right? I'm thinking of like a good example is like in Troy, the one with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana as Achilles and Hector respectively. And there's a scene where Hector is like, you know, when we're gonna have this fight to the death, but let's make this deal, right, with the gods as our witness. And Hector tries to bargain with Achilles. The loser gets a proper burial, right? Because they know. I mean, this was in ancient Greece, right? In that movie, like they know, like more often than not, that people are in war are really disrespectful, right, to a dead person. And so the idea is like when people have these duels to the death, they always request to have a proper burial, and it's exactly because of this, right? Because more often than not, people aren't going to respect your dead body. They already killed you. They already didn't this. They already didn't respect you in life. What makes you think they're going to respect you in death, right? Like, I mean, that's a completely logical thing to think. And so, like, when you, I know I'm kind of like going on this long tangent here, but going back with like Saul committing seppuku, there's a complete, I mean, it's easy for us as moderns to look at like touchy touchy conversation topic here, but like suicide is very cowardly, right? It's easy to view suicide as very cowardly, but of course, like it is most of the time when it's just like people, and of course, like I know there's always like mental health issues and stuff like that. That it's not as clear cut and it's not an easy thing to deal with. Of course, it isn't, but at the same time, it is always the weaker thing to do. And of course, yes, we must be um, compassionate to people who do succumb to their weakness in that way. It can't be helped. No one, outside the person of Jesus Christ, none of us have the strength, right? And if a guy goes that far, I mean, outside of the outside of the power of God, I mean, what hope do we have? And so if people do cave into their weakness, it can't be helped. But at the same time, the reality of it, right? Of course, we should still be, we should still be extremely sympathetic, but that doesn't change the fact that suicide is more often than not the weaker way out, right? It's the weaker action to take. But in war, it would actually be viewed the opposite way because of how disrespectful people are to the dead. And that's another thing where, and of course, we run into a whole different problem, but I'll get to that in a bit. But then we run into the whole problem of like, or sorry, backtrack a bit. Before I get to the problem, I mean, another thing too, where like, you think of like people, like someone like Saul here committing suicide, and it's different from like how it would be viewed today, was because of like how people respect and disrespect living and dead in the world, right? In the world today, we're supposed to be extremely respectful, right? And we don't disrespect the dead, and the last like the last thing you do is defecate a guy's corpse, right? Like that is a crime beyond a crime, right? But of course, ancient world, they don't care about stuff like that, right? You kill somebody, you do whatever they want, you do whatever you want. And so, as Saul was kind of, with the rape jokes, right? And the wordplay of suggesting that the Philistines would rape him. Saul would rather take his own life than to have that happen. And to be fair, I think most people would take that route, right? Not to downplay either, of those two very serious things, that we're now talking about, because the Bible brought them up. Okay, I wouldn't have brought this up on my own volition, but the Bible brought it up. So, with that being said, though, then suicide looks like clearly the better choice here because the alternative is definitely worse, and any person would tell you that, right? And that's obviously why systems like seppuku exist, right? That we can give ourselves the mental resolve to be able to do something like that. Because in like as I've said earlier, and I know it's gonna, I know some of you will probably like might get defensive about it, but I think, I mean, we gotta be able to talk about these kind of things, and I think we have to face the reality. As much as we want to be empathetic to people and sympathetic, but suicide more often than not is the weak man's move. But at times, you would still choose it over something way worse, right? And so, yeah, like, and to be fair, like, it depends on certain contexts too, right? When I say like the weaker man's move, like, okay, in Saul's case, like, I can't say it's strength to endure, you know, thrusting from a bunch of Philistine guys. That's not strength at all, right? Right. So death is not I can't view death, taking your own life, as the weaker move in that scenario, right? As opposed to like if you look at the when people talk about like suicide today, it's not like you're most of the time you're not in those kind of extreme situations, and so that's why it's easier to make that claim. And some of you may disagree, but it's easier for me to make the claim that like, oh, it's the weaker man's move today, because like, what are you comparing it to, right? We're not comparing it to something like Saul here, right, and getting thrusted by a bunch of Philistine men. That's definitely way worse, right? And not just by a little, but like by a lot, right? So, suicide is not the weak man's move here, right? Because I would not say that it takes real strength to endure that. But when people talk about like, okay, like a guy may commit suicide because of like a mental health thing, and I know some people say, well, now I'm just being like toxic positivity, but real strength is being able to fight some of those problems in our life, right? And even our mental illness. And you know, when I've known people who are fighting the fight, right? And they acknowledge they will never be healed of their mental illness in this life, right? And of course, it's all the more reason, you know, to put our faith in Jesus and to hope for the life that he gives us in the resurrection. Because I've seen people, they're fighting with their mental illness and they will never get out of it in this life. That's just the fact of the matter. Not in this life, they're not, right? But they hope in the resurrection that God will give them a new life that's free of that, right? But the easy way out would be, to take their own lives, but they don't, right? And that, and this is more anecdotal, of course, but from that I see real strength in them, right? That's a real strength. But Saul's case is not. That's completely different, right? To endure like, all these people doing like atrocities to you would not be strength at all, right? You're just like a psychopath who's a glutton for punishment or something like that. But I know that reading this part with Saul and him accepting his fate, and I know I jumped into some dark territory here, but it is something that the Bible does bring up, and it's something that Saul had to deal with and he had to face, right, when it comes to his fate. And that's the interesting thing to think about too when it comes to like, we think about like as I mentioned before, with the decisions we make, right? And in a sense, this is where Christianity has that like paradox of like there's free will and there's predetermination. And so the free will is that we do get to choose what we do in life. But when with the consequences of our choices, they come back for us, and that becomes our fate, right? And that you have to deal with it. You can't escape it, right? And so, of course, I know some people use it as like a scare tactic, but in reality, though, and you can't get away from the reality, is that like if we choose not to follow God, then the prospect of hell, right? That is the real, the real outcome, right? And you have to face that, and it's not going to be pretty, right? And so that's where like the Bible wrestles with this idea of like free will versus like predestination. And so Saul had kind of conceded to that, right? But of course he wanted to have that little bit of control left in his life as he commits seppuku, right? And that's kind of the most interesting part of this chapter, right? And it's kind of how the Bible paints the end of Saul's life and the end of the tale of the first king, right? This is how he goes, not in a blaze of glory, but in this solemn facing your fate and trying to have some control of it, even though you ultimately don't, right? Because even, when Saul's like, these people would like abuse me, they still did, even when he was dead, right? By treating his body with contempt. And so it does really show, the cruelty of the ancient world. And at the same time, that was the fate that Saul had to deal with. And it is pretty rough to read, right? I mean, First Samuel does not end on a very happy note, because it ends on the tale of one bad king, right? and this is how he meets his end. That was a really solemn way to end it. Basically done with reading First Samuel. That's how it ends, and it ends on a cliffhanger, of course. Because of course, technically, as I've said many a times, you're supposed to read the book of Samuel as one book, right? First and Second Samuel as one book. So you're not like, even though I've said it like it's the end of First Samuel, right? Because it is, but you're not supposed to really view it as the end of anything, right? It's just a part of the story, and you continue on with the beginning of Second Samuel, which is just if you were to treat the book of, and this is all the more reason why you should treat the book of Samuel as one book, right? Is that this is just another chapter, and you move on to see what happens next, because you will get to see basically what happens next, right? Immediately after. But as far as, I think this theme that the writer was getting at was that, like, this is how Saul will meet. This is how he meets his end. One bad king bites the dust, right? That is the fate of the bad king. And so that is the end of First Samuel / the intermission for the book of Samuel before we go on to the next stream, and we will move on to the next king, more or less, because David won't be kinged right away, just like how Saul wasn't. But you get the idea, right? We're going to be moving. We have ended the tale of one king, and we move on to the tale of the second king. After all, the book of Samuel, in a way, is a tale of two kings, right? We had just kind of ended the arc of one, and now we will move on to the other. So that is going to be it for this reading. I will do some housekeeping. You guys will, if you have questions or whatever, ask me at any time. You can definitely ask me on Discord. You can leave something in the chat, whatever, and ask me a question. But I'm just going to do some housekeeping, and if there's nothing else to say, then we will end the stream here. So, first and foremost, next week, I'm not sure what I'm doing next week for Monday. I don't know if I want to start the next project I want to do, because I did finish the StarCraft one. One thing I could do is play. I said I was going to do this last week, but I ended up kind of not doing it because I was kind of out of it, right? I wasn't in the mood. But I might just do show you some other features of StarCraft 2, like the co-op mode, which is kind of nice, and show that off for a little bit. Of course, because co-op missions is hard to show that off for 4 hours. So maybe Monday's stream will be a shorter one where I just show off a few of that, and then Wednesday, if I end up going that route, because I don't know if I want to start the new project, I might actually wait till July to start the next project. We'll see. I know that sounds like a long time, but we'll see. Because I don't know if I want to start it this week. I mean, anything could happen. I could just start the new project this Monday. Depends on my mood on it, honestly. We'll see. But if I go the first route and don't start the new project on Monday and play some StarCraft 2 on Monday, then Wednesday I will do more DBD or Dead by Daylight with my buddy Baruka. We have a grand old time. So Burke and I will play again on Wednesday if I play StarCraft on Monday. So basically, tune in on Monday's stream and you'll kind of know how the Wednesday stream will go, basically. And then next Thursday, of course, I'm continuing Heroes Might Magic 2. I did finish the rolling campaign yesterday, so I'll be starting the Price of Loyalty expansion pack campaigns, because there's 4 of them. One of them I might not play on camera because, well, we'll see. We'll see if I end up doing it. I will start off relatively light though, and I'll do the easy campaign, the 4 of them, because it's funny. I'll talk about it more on the next week's Throwback Thursday episode, which you should definitely check out. And then of course next Friday we will begin 2nd Samuel at 3 o'clock next week, and we'll begin 2nd Samuel. So that's kind of how next week is going to look. And I might as well point this out now, because I know it's not for like another 2 weeks. But, I mean, this might be one reason why. Well, this is another reason why I don't want to start the new project right away. Because not next week, but the week after, I have to change the streaming thing a little bit. Where on the 30th of June, I won't be streaming. The 30th is a Wednesday. I won't be streaming that day because I have to work that night. But to make up for it, I will stream maybe even like extra hour or something on the Thursday on July 1st, which is Canada Day. Now, of course, for you Americans, that's like whatever, right? But I will stream on Thursday Canada Day instead of the 30th of June. And we'll see. Maybe I'll just do like a regular kind of game stream. Maybe it would be a good opportunity to start the next project because it would be the beginning of July. So that's when I would for sure start the next streaming project. So the beginning of July. So I might even start it on the 1st. We'll see. But I just wanted to keep your eyes peeled for that because the 30th will not have a stream, but the 1st will. So that week we'll have no Wednesday, but we'll have a Thursday. And then that, of course, runs into like whether I do like Throwback Thursdays as well, right? And how I do it. But yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say for announcements. If there's nothing else to be said, then I believe this is the end of the stream. I hope you guys learned something today. I hope you guys enjoyed going through the ending of 1 Samuel with me. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your Friday. I hope you guys have a great weekend. And God bless you. Have a great day.